Привет. These are difficult times for all of us and for our countries. We are all worried and concerned about our health and the health of our children. COVID-19 has confined us to our homes. COVID-19 has stopped our children from going to school. It has confined us from going to restaurants, to bars, to meet face-to-face in person. COVID-19 stopped us from socializing. COVID-19, however, can never confine our spirit of friendship. It can never confine our cultures. It can never confine our willingness to discover each other, to talk to each other, even if digitally. So when the All-State Library for Foreign Languages contacted me and explained this project, I accepted open-heartedly and with enthusiasm, because I believe that this is one way of defeating COVID. I will talk to you about my country, Malta, a small island in the Mediterranean. But as I will try to show you, Malta has a very committed history. A history which is much larger than its size. I will start by citing a few names of historical personalities. What is in common between Homer, the great Greek writer, Cicero, the famous Roman orator, the Apostle St. Paul, King Henry VIII of England, Emperor Charles V, William Shakespeare, Caravaggio, Empress Catherine II of Russia, Tsar Paul I of Russia, Napoleon Bonaparte, Lord Nelson, Sir Walter Scott, Lord Byron, President Roosevelt, Stalin, Churchill, President Kennedy, Queen Elizabeth II of Great Britain, President Gorbachev, President Bush. It's a predictable answer. The common element is Malta. All these personalities and many more have something to say about Malta. They have a personal story to relate about Malta. I find that one of the best ways how to explain Malta is to start through the contradictions of Malta. A contradiction of small landmass versus huge maritime territory. A contradiction of its geography versus its geostrategic location. A contradiction of its resources, a small island, versus its global impact, be it economic, political, and even social. Now, if there is one element which defines Malta, or rather defined Malta throughout the ages and still defines Malta, is its geography. Any aeroplane that needs to go from east of the Mediterranean to west, or from the south to the north, needs to cross over Malta. Malta is a crossroad of civilizations. It is a crossroads where east meets west and where the south meets the north. At the door of Africa, but on the European continental shelf. Now, it is this geography, or better still, the geostrategic location of Malta, that made every power that be throughout the ages wanting to occupy Malta. From the very dawn of civilization, the Phoenicians, later the Romans, the Arabs, the Normans, the Knights of Malta, the French, the British, and of course during the Second World War, the Nazis. They wanted to occupy Malta at all costs. This geostrategic location, position of Malta, I believe, was illustrated very clearly with the words of Napoleon Bonaparte when he learned that the British forces had landed in Malta, and he said, "I would have rather seen the British forces on the hills of Montmartre than in Malta." In other words, he said, "I would have preferred to see the British forces on the hills surrounding Paris than in Malta." Why? Because Malta was the door to Africa. So, in one word, Malta sells geography. Now let me focus a little bit on our history. Malta has a very spectacular history. Malta itself is an open air museum. And yet, so many people know about the historical contributions of Malta. I often follow this saying that Malta is victim of its size. Because it's small, it does not have the visibility. And I'll give some examples. If I were to tell you pyramids of Egypt, everyone knows what they are, everyone knows where they are. If I were to say Stonehenge, everyone can picture them in their mind. But if I were to tell you the Gigantia temples, the Hypogeo, very few people know what I'm talking about. And yet, what I've just mentioned are the oldest free-standing temples ever built by man. The oldest temples known to man are actually found in Malta, and not one, but several of them. They are so old that they predate the pyramids of Egypt by 2,000 years. If we were to discuss the history of Malta, it would take us ages. Malta bears a very fascinating, interesting, victorious, and even responsible history. A history that has left its mark on the world. The prehistoric temples, the Punic Wars, and even more importantly, the Great Siege of Valletta in 1565, and then the Second World War, when indeed Malta was the only and last remaining pocket in the West which did not succumb to the Axis forces, to Nazism. Truly, there is parallelism between the Nazi blockade of St. Petersburg and what Malta experienced during the Second World War. Malta, in fact, was the most bombed land during the Second World War in the West. And it was effectively starved to death. All these historical episodes are of epic proportions. It is also pertinent to point that Malta is one of the few countries mentioned in the Bible. It's actually one of the earliest Christian communities when it is calculated in 60 Anno Domini, that is 27 years after the first Easter, after the resurrection of Christ. Malta was converted to Christianity by Apostle St. Paul, who on his way to Rome was shipwrecked to Malta, where he stayed and introduced Christianity. Another pertinent point to explain is that during the Second World War, the liberation of Italy was actually launched from Malta. We often hear about the landings in Normandy and the liberation of Europe from the East, but there was a very important role Malta played, which was the liberation of Italy, and this was launched from exactly Malta. As was also launched from Malta the counter-offensive on Rommel in North Africa. This role of Malta during the Second World War earned it the title of the unsinkable aircraft carrier. This historical availability of Malta continues till this very date. Again, I want to mention the end of the Cold War, which was declared in Malta precisely 30 years ago, when the USA and the then USSR met in Malta, and in the words of Eduard Shevardnadze, who was then the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union, said, "We buried the Cold War in the seas of Malta." Here I wish to ponder for a moment on the state of bilateral relations between Malta and the Russian relations. these relations are actually anchored in history, and they go back to the time of Catherine, the Great Catherine II, who had very, very close relations with Malta, to the extent that she sent her officers to train in Malta, and during the tumultuous Russo-Turkish War, some Maltese actually fought alongside Russian forces, especially in the Battle of Chesma. This close relationship, in fact, is recognized by the fact that Empress Catherine II sent to Malta a very beautiful portrait of herself painted by Levitsky. This portrait is at the Grand Master's Palace in Malta, and we brought it over last year at the Tsaritsino Reserve, Palace and Reserve, where it was on exhibition for the first time in 250 years almost on Russian soil. There was also the episode of of Tsar Paul I of Russia, who was supposed to take over the Order of Malta, but then Napoleon in the meantime had landed in Malta, and Tsar Paul I was assassinated. These are important episodes that shows how far our bilateral relations go. If I may, let me speak a bit about our neutrality. Malta is the Constitution of Malta recognizes the neutrality of Malta in foreign affairs. Neutrality, in fact, is our cornerstone in foreign affairs. This is, as I said, enshrined in our Constitution. Malta was, and the independent Malta was never a member of NATO. It was never a member of the Warsaw Pact. Malta does not have any ambitions to join any military alliance, be it NATO or other, and this is a convergence of all the political spectrum in Malta. So, what is the strength of Malta in foreign affairs? Well, it is this neutrality which we draw our strength from this neutrality, because we base our opinions, our views, our actions on principles of international law. We do not base our decisions on alliances. We decide on international law, on the principles enshrined in the charters of the United Nations. And it is precisely this impartiality, this neutral personality, that gives us our credibility. There is another element I wish to bring into the picture. It is an element which, on the one hand, is a very common element for the Maltese people, as common as the air we breathe. On the other hand, it is another important element of Malta's foreign policy. This is the sea. Growing up on an island, that very beautiful blue Mediterranean Sea is so present to us. It makes it part of our daily reality. Now, upon its independence in 1964, Malta sought to make a contribution, an academic contribution, to the international community. And it came out with this proposal to enact together within the United Nations a legislation that would regulate relations at sea. Before that, there was no real regulations, no real legislations. This concept, which came to be known as pace in maribus sol, or peace at seas, is today the main legislative bodies that govern our relations in seas. Yet, as a result of this concept, another element was born. An element which in 1964, when it was first introduced, it was very innovative. I would say even revolutionary. This is the concept of common heritage of mankind, or collective responsibility. Now, personally, I believe that probably the maintenance of this notion of collective responsibility is going to be the main challenge of the future generations, present and future generations, to maintain faith in this notion of collective responsibility. At this day and age, when we see the withdrawal of important arms control mechanisms and withdrawal of important agreements, depletion of political support to multilateral fora is going to require leadership, determination, and visionaries. This common heritage of mankind concept is so evident today, it's so clear, even in our reality as we confront the common challenge of COVID-19. When you take this concept and considering it as the impact collective responsibility has on climate change, for example, which is another common challenge, you will see one understands how what a visionary Malta 1964. I wish to conclude my few remarks about Malta, my country, with a little explanation of the Maltese language, because I believe the Maltese language captures the character and personifies not just the historical experiences of Malta, but also all that Malta is and all that Malta stands for. The Maltese language at base is a Semitic language, classical Arabic. As much as 60 to 70% comes from Arabic. It contains, however, a strong presence of words that originate from Italian, English, and French. It is written with Latin alphabet, and the syntax is close to continental languages, particularly Italian. As you can see, the Maltese language is a fusion of other languages. And I think this is why I particularly like to emphasize and explain the Maltese language, because it explains what Malta of today is. Malta does not consider itself as a frontier of Europe, rather as a bridge between the north and the south, as a place of dialogue between the Christian world and the Islamic world, as a place for meetings between Europe and the Arab world. I really hope that you have enjoyed my few thoughts about Malta. I promise you that next time we will meet in person, but until then, please take good care of yourselves, stay safe, obey the authorities. My last thought goes to the All State Library for Foreign Literature for giving me this opportunity and for bringing us out of our homes and into your homes through this digital platform. I thank you.